Chapter 10, Key Issue 3, is about the distribution of agriculture and really the different types of agriculture that you need to know. We're going to talk about them divided up into subsistence and commercial agriculture. And we'll be able to explain how pastoral nomadism works in the dry lands. We'll talk about shifting cultivation, intensive subsistence farming, how crops other than white rice are grown in the intensive subsistence way. We'll talk about mixed crop and how livestock farming works. We'll talk about dairy farming, Great and Mediterranean farming, and then what ranching is. To begin with, a geographer named Derwent Whitsley identified 11 main agricultural regions, plus an area where agriculture was non-existent. So we have 5 types of agriculture present in developing countries: pastoral nomadism, shifting cultivation, intensive subsistence with wet rice, intensive subsistence with something other than rice, and then plantation crops. And in developed countries, you'll see mixed crop and livestock, dairy farms, grain, ranching, Mediterranean farming, and commercial or truck farming. So if you look at these maps here, the first map shows you where you're going to find the different types of agriculture. And you'll see them broken down into 2 main patterns. So subsistence agriculture is going to be found in the less developed countries. So you're going to find subsistence farming in these countries that are considered developing. And that pattern will closely match that of the pattern from the last chapter, with where people are getting different grains, whether they're dependent on grains or meat for protein, high natural increase rate, a lower level of development. So these are patterns that will be pretty familiar to you at this point. And then within those regions, you're going to see where is things like wet rice crops dominant, where is pastoral nomadism dominant. And so within the difference between the developed and the developing world, you'll also notice that you'll be looking at those climate regions like we talked about way back in chapter 1. So if you are in a tropical dry environment, you'll be practicing pastoral nomadism. If you are in a developing country but it is tropical and wet, you'll be practicing wet rice subsistence farming. And so the way we track these patterns is first, is it a developed or developing country? And then what is the climate like? What are they able to grow? So we'll start off with agriculture in developing regions. Pastoral nomadism is a form of subsistence agriculture, and it's really based on the herding of domestic animals. So it's like the subsistence version of ranching. There's lots of different approaches, and sometimes they are also reliant on sedentary agriculture with the herding of livestock, and sometimes they are fully nomadic. Some nomads obtain grain from other sedentary subsistence farmers. They trade with them. But more commonly, women and children of the group will tend crops at a fixed location, and then they'll move to a new location once the crops have been harvested. Sometimes they hire workers to practice the agriculture while they move around, and sometimes nomads will stay in place for a long time when rainfall is abundant, and then if you hit a dry spell, then they'll move on to a new area. Pastoral nomadism isn't an ancient form. It's not a primitive form of farming. It really branched off of sedentary farming, and it's a way of living in an area that has long dry seasons. So people, instead of struggling or suffering from drought, they would just move to a new area where they could raise their food, have enough food for their animals. And so they just had really like a fixed path that they would move around in instead of suffering through hard times. Shifting cultivation, and it's very different than burning down a whole rainforest to plant like a sugar plantation, and I wanted to set up the stage with that. Shifting cultivation will be found in primarily tropical regions in a developing country, and what characterizes shifting cultivation is first, the farmers clear the land, and they plant flashing they cut down all the plants and they burn it. When they burn it, the potash is potassium rich and it provides fertilizer, so it makes the soil really rich to grow crops. And they'll grow crops for 2 to 3 years until the nutrients are depleted, and then they abandon it for 6 to 20 years later, and they abandon that small patch of land, the rainforest will tend to take it back over. And then when they come back 6 to 20 years later, they cut it down, burn the vegetation again, and then they have rich soil to grow their crops for 2 to 3 years. Traditionally, the land that they were harvesting was collectively owned by the village, but today private individuals own the land, especially in Latin America. So here's a group of people in sub-Saharan Africa clearing the brush, burning it. They're going to plant crops there, and they'll come back in a few years. Intensive subsistence farming is one of the most common types of farming in the developing world. So it feeds about 3/4 of the world's people who live in developing countries. These farmers work intensively to live on a small parcel of land. So most of the hand work is done by hand or maybe with some animals, like an ox-drawn plow. Most of available land is used to produce this food. And the parcels of land are small. They use every available piece of land because they're trying to feed a lot of people. So you have a lot of farmers per acre of farmable land. So you have a high agricultural density. You also have a high population or arithmetic density. So one of the most common is wet rice. This is when rice is planted on dry land in a nursery, and then it's moved as seedlings to a flooded area to promote its growth. So here you can see where rice is produced in million metric tons. You can see the U.S. is a pretty large producer of rice, between 10 and 99 million metric tons of rice a day, or a year, but a day would be incredible. But in the U.S., it's done in commercial farms. In places like India and rural China, it's planted by hand in this labor-intensive type of farming, the wet rice. Here you can see someone using an ox to plow the land. So instead of using tractors, they're still using animals, and it's very labor-intensive. It takes a lot of work. The entire family has a role in these types of farms, whether it's plowing the land or planting the seedlings, usually harvesting the seeds by hand. Here you see rice paddies. So this is where the rice seedlings are planted afterwards. And you see the weird shapes? They've used every single piece of land they can to grow the rice on. Even little tiny hills here. This is also called terracing. So rice is grown in paddies, usually on terraces. So they build up the land and flatten it so they can flood these areas. And again, they're using every possible inch of land that they can. Wet rice farming is a dominant type of agriculture in southeastern China, East India, and Southeast Asia. The climate prevents farmers from growing wet rice in portions of Asia, where summer rain is too low and winters are too harsh, and they would practice a different type. Non-wet rice dominant subsistence agriculture would include growing corn or growing wheat, but still the plowing, right? The animal plowing, the labor-intensive work by hand, threshing the wheat by hand. And the other type of agriculture you're going to see in developed countries is run like commercial agriculture, but it's commercial agriculture in a developed country. And usually it's plantations, things like banana plantations, sugar plantations, palm oil plantations. A plantation is usually owned by a European or North American company, although not always. And this is large-scale farming in the developed world, or the developing world. In developed regions, you're going to see commercial agriculture in these 6 types that we talked about earlier. And we'll be talking about agribusiness. Agribusiness refers to these types of farmings. So because a family farm is not isolated, even if you have a smaller family farm, you're probably selling your product to a large company. So if you're growing corn, but you're selling it to Tyson to feed their chickens, you're part of agribusiness. If you're raising chickens, but you've leased equipment from Tyson, you're part of agribusiness. If you're growing tomatoes and you're selling them to Del Monte to can, you're part of agribusiness. So most farmers in the U.S. are part of this large food production industry. When we look at it, we're going to see mixed crop and livestock farming. This is where you have both usually a grain crop like corn growing on your land, but you also have animals. And in this case, most of the crops are fed to animals instead of humans. So in a mixed crop and livestock farming, most land is devoted to growing crops, but about 3/4 of its income might come from animal products. So it has lots of land to grow corn, but most of its income comes from corn or from eggs or from beef. This allows farmers to distribute the workload evenly through the year because the crops require less attention except for like in the spring and the fall when you're planting and then harvesting. It usually involves crop rotation, which means they use different fields from crop to crop in different years, and this avoids depleting the nutrients in the soil. So they might have corn planted on the land one year, the next year they might plant something like carrots or potatoes, the following year they might use soybeans. Soybeans will replenish the nitrogen in the soil, and then they might grow like alfalfa and then rotate back to corn. So here you can see them harvesting corn with a big machine, right? So in the developed world, what you're going to see is you're not going to see animals bringing plows around. You're going to see farmers and tractors. You're going to see large parcels of land. You're going to see it looking very culturally homogeneous. You're going to see giant machinery doing everything from harvesting the food to planting the food to separating, like the grains of corn from the cob. The next type of farm we talk about is dairy farming. Dairy farming is really important because you're going to see it closer to large cities across the world than you will other types of farming. And this is because milk is perishable. It doesn't last for very long. So the ring surrounding a city from which milk can be supplied is called the milk shed. And with advances in transportation, the radius of the milk shed is about 500 kilometers or 300 miles. So it's much larger than it used to be. But still, you wouldn't want to ship your milk from California to Florida to eat, to drink. So most of the milk you get in Florida is going to come from somewhere in Florida, usually within 300 miles of where we're at. Now, things like cheese can be distributed from across the country because it doesn't go bad as fast. You can see the U.S. ranks within some of the top milk production in the world, although the highest is going to be in India. The next type of farming is commercial gardening or fruit farming. It's also called truck farming, when truck would have meant bartering for exchange of commodities, not like a giant truck. But they are sold off of trucks, transported. This is when you're going to grow lots of the fruits and vegetables that people eat. So apples, cherries, asparagus, lettuce, mushrooms, potatoes. We have a lot of truck farming in Florida. We grow a lot of tomatoes. We grow a lot of eggplants. We grow pineapples. Some of the fruits and vegetables are sold fresh to the consumers, but a lot of them are sold to processors to can or to freeze. These are highly efficient, large-scale operations, and they still use machines as much as possible. The labor costs are kept down by hiring migrant farm workers to harvest. And usually, if you are a truck farmer or commercial gardener, you specialize in a few crops. Grain farming is very similar to mixed crop and livestock, but instead of the crops being grown mostly for animals to eat, you're growing the crops for humans to eat. You might have grain farmers that have, cattle or chickens as well, but the grains that they're growing, they're going to sell. And most of the farms are going to sell their outputs to people who create other food products, like breakfast cereals or breads. And you're going to see it. The farm is highly mechanized. Farms are large, and they're oriented to consumer preferences. One of the last types is Mediterranean agriculture. In Mediterranean agriculture, you have to be near the sea and usually on the west coast of continents. You need to have moisture from the sea, and you need to have a moderate winter climate. You get a small amount of income from your animal products, and most of the crops are grown for human consumption. And this is really a focus on horticulture, so fruits, vegetables, and flowers. And we're looking for things like olives and grapes from Mediterranean climates. So here's an example of olive grove, growing olives in the Mediterranean climate. And then we have ranching. Ranching is the commercial grazing of livestock, huge farms suited for arid or semi-arid land, although it's not always like the outdoor, like cowboy kind of thing. We have lots of cattle that are raised indoors, and we'll look at some of those today. And most ranchers are associated with the meat processing industry because everything's going to kind of work together. So here are people moving cattle, and this is more of like a traditional ranch. This place still exists. But this isn't what all, this is kind of an idealized picture. So we'll look at some other types of animal cultivation in class today.